Hi, Tracy. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Cindy. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I am excited to be sitting with you and finally
Same.
having this
I
conversation.
know. We've been in touch for a little while now, and I've been so excited to bring you onto the podcast, and I'm glad that we're doing it now, not only to have this conversation, but to talk about your book. I didn't sign up for this. I'm so excited. By the way, my husband said, I love that title.
Oh, he did?
Yes.
Yes.
He's
Oh,
like,
I
I
love
loved it.
that.
That was his first reaction because he got it in the mail and then he opened it and said, this is a great title. So I'm excited to share this with everybody today. And I have so many questions for you. So let's get started. When we were chatting about this conversation, there's so many angles that we can take because I think there's so many struggles that we're having as, partners and even with kids. Obviously, from Curious Neuron perspective, there's kids involved, and it
Yes.
changes a lot. And I think something that I've experienced and also heard from my friends is sometimes there's a moment or a phase or a very long period of disconnect and you feel stuck in these cycles. You brought this up in your book, these cycles, these negative cycles. And also what was funny to me is you were mentioning like the dishes and you get stuck on these tiny little arguments that we do, but it's not really about that. So let's begin our conversation there. Maybe like on these little arguments, and what are these negative cycles and how can we identify them?
Yes, I love this place to start. And just really want to say that again, how much I love that your husband liked the title
Yes,
because
he
it
did.
was something that kept showing up in my sessions because
Mm,
truly we come into our relationships with expectations,
mhm.
with our own understandings of what a relationship means. And for many of us, well-intentioned, we believe our relationships should be easy and
Mhm.
seamless and effortless. And our media teaches that, our
Mhm.
books show it, our
Right.
films, right? So we think it should just be easy. And in those early days, it is easy because you have more time to explore and be curious and to get to know each other. In addition to that time, you also tend to be more open and flexible, and you maybe don't have any beliefs or assumptions built about your partner or
Mm.
in those early
It's
days.
true. Mhm.
And then what then starts to happen though is that the stressors pile on. And we know specifically thinking of who's here with us for curious neurons and for the parents of children is that when you have children, it can often feel like you are two ships passing in the night.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this kind of gap, this disconnection can really make it more difficult to solve the everyday problems that you maybe either had more time and space before kids to
Mhm.
solve. So
Right.
sometimes if something was frustrating you, maybe you were able to work through it on your own and it didn't irk you as much. Or maybe even you were able to have that time to resolve it.
Mm.
We also know you weren't as sleep deprived,
Mhm.
perhaps, right? You weren't sleep deprived. There's not the hormones. There's not this huge identity shift that parents go through after having a child. So what tends to happen, and I really want listeners to know this, is that the research shows 67% of couples experience a significant decrease in their relationship satisfaction after
Mhm.
having a baby. That's really high.
Mhm. But it's
Most
it's
couples.
it's important for us to hear that because we do feel sometimes that it's only us or that we're alone, but it's nice to know you're not the only one going through this.
Absolutely. You're
Mhm.
not the only one. And so, what then tends to happen is we start to have these patterns of more negative emotions,
Mm.
things like anger and frustration. And then we start to, due to that disconnection, the demands on us as new parents, the not having time, then we stop expressing our feelings and needs. Or over time, we don't know how to do that in a way that's going to work for us in those harder moments. And so then what we tend to see show up is we get into these really tricky communication patterns that become self-reinforcing cycles.
Mm.
So we'll go from Doctors John and Julie Gottman, and then also Dr. Sue Johnson's research. So the Gottmans found that there are these 4 negative communication patterns: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, shutting down, and contempt.
Mm.
And their research found that these patterns are predictive of divorce. Now, of course, if anyone is like, ooh, we get stuck in these patterns, yes, and recognizing them is a really first important step. You can make those changes and move through that. So it's important to see how we're communicating. But then what we know, what comes out of that is that it sounds like I blame you, I criticize you because you're defensive and you shut down all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the other partner says, I shut down all the time and I'm so defensive because you're so angry and critical towards me.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates the negative cycles that couples get stuck in, which is talked about by Dr. Sue Johnson, those 3 common cycles, which is find the bad guy. That's like you're blaming each other. It's you. No, it's you. If you only, well, you should.
Right.
Or
Yes.
we have the polka dance, which is one person is pursuing for connection and the other one shuts down. And then that last one is the freeze and flee, where partners don't bring up their difficult issues. So we see then that over time, with more disconnection, more distress, these cycles become more entrenched. And that's when we really start to get into this place of, this isn't what I signed up for.
Right. And I find that with children, it's easy to get into those cycles and ignore them because you're so busy with kids around you and activities and school and whatever it is, that you can have those arguments that are part of those cycles. And instead of addressing it, you're just kind of like sweeping it under the rug. And the next day happens and the next week and month, and you haven't addressed it yet. So it builds a lot of that disconnect sometimes, within the couple. You have these 3 sections in your book: aware, acknowledge, and align. And I find it really interesting because when it comes to emotions and kids and parents, I always talk about awareness being first. And you brought that up as well in your book. So if you are at least noticing that these cycles are happening, what's the awareness part? How does that fit within this?
That awareness piece is recognizing what is just happening in front of you. And we know from the work of emotionally focused couples therapy that the first order of change is about being able to stop the cycle. We can't change anything if there isn't that level of awareness of what's happening between you two. And that often can even be that shift from, whoa, hang on, we're doing this like back and forth thing right here, and that's not going to move us forward. So let's be shoulder to shoulder and put that problem in front of us. And by doing that, we're going to get curious about how we each see it. Here's my experience internally, my thoughts, my feelings, my own opinions and values, and then tell me yours. Okay, now we can see both of these, and now let's find the solution in front of us. But that takes that awareness of what's actually happening. So stopping the cycle is really that first piece of change that we want to be able to do. And that awareness of, okay, so what's the pattern that we're in? What communication patterns am I using? What are some of the feelings that I'm having inside that I haven't necessarily brought to the forefront? What's actually happening in front of us? So I love that you've connected that to the work that you're doing with children as well.
And, another aspect of this is kind of going backwards a little bit and trying to see what we're bringing into this relationship. You talk about attachment and you bring, an important point in terms of like, what is our attachment style? I've had this discussion with my friends and we talk with our partners who feel that going back into the past and kind of identifying certain things is kind of justifying the certain behaviors you're doing or patterns, but that you don't need to look back. You can just move forward. Why look back? So if somebody is listening to this and struggling to have this conversation with a partner or with themselves in terms of having to look back and identifying certain things of their past, why is it important and where do we begin?
We form our brains based on those early experiences. And you can speak to that working with children much better than I can. But we know that we learn what it means to be an individual, to be the I, to be a we, to be in relationship with other person, and then to also be out in the world and how we view others. And based on those early experiences, we develop strategies as ways of coping. And we can think of attachment. And I know social media and kind of more the pop psychology likes to really define the styles where people will use language like, oh, that's just my anxious attachment showing up, or, oh, I'm so avoidantly attached. And then we get into the comparisons of like, well, it's better to be avoidant than anxious because I don't need anybody, right? So I like to step out of that and really coming back to the research, which is around attachment being dimensional. And we each have levels of anxiety. We each have levels of avoidance. And really what that means is about strategies to cope in distressing moments. Can I turn to you? And can I also, the dimensions specifically are, do I believe I'm good? And do I believe that you are trustworthy and I can lean on you? And those are those two dimensions from the attachment perspective. And we develop those internal beliefs, these working models inside of our mind from those early childhood experiences. Was my caregiver there for me? Did they respond to my needs with warmth, consistency, not perfect all the time, but relative consistency? Or did they reject me? Did they neglect? Did they make fun of me? Did they belittle me? And those become this roadmap inside of us where in distressing moments, when our brains go offline, we're going to default to those strategies. I like to remind people that insight into the past is important. Insight into why we do the things we do today is one piece of it, but to not get stuck there. So it's kind of the both end when you started saying you and your friends or sometimes our partners are like, well, the past is not important.
Right.
It matters to understand what we default to, but then to also then say, well, what are we going to do today? Because what so often happens, Cindy, is that two partners will be standing in front of each other. And if I'm looking at my partner and they say something, it's coming into my brain through all of my previous experiences and my beliefs and perceptions. And sometimes what happens is that it's almost like all of my past experiences are standing behind him. And so when he says something like, what's for dinner? A like normal, benign question that it could maybe be like, well, what's for dinner, right? If I maybe grew up in a hostile or critical family, or if it's like, you get the point, but it's so important to understand what those internalized perceptions and assumptions are. And so let's not get stuck on that, but rather how does our past today influence what we do with our partners?
It changes how we take in that information, right? That interpretation of what they're saying, I guess, in a sense. And it's like you said, such a simple question of what's for dinner. But again, I think for me, I look at it from a dysregulation standpoint as well, where you might not take it in the same way one day versus the other because of the day you've had, or I call them sometimes like these micro emotional moments where you don't even realize and you don't have the awareness of what's going on. So it's so important to be able to recognize that, whether it's your far past or immediate past of that morning and something happened, there's a lot that interprets that affects how you're interpreting it. So it's so important. You brought up this term, this idea interdependence at the beginning of your book. And I thought that was really interesting because we do want to make sure that we continue to be our own person. I've heard this too in terms of conversations with friends. You continue that growth, but then you don't want to be dependent on your partner, but then you are sometimes. How do we navigate that sort of relationship?
Yeah, there's this misbelief that dependency is bad. And yet what we know biologically is we need to depend on others. We are hardwired for connection, for soothing, safety, security. That is that attachment piece. And so interdependence recognizes, though, that we're trying to hold both between the intimacy and the connection piece and also the autonomy and independence piece. And it sounds almost easy for me to say, yes, here we are trying to hold both. I am me, you are you, and we are both okay. And now we're going to co-create our worlds together. And yet there's so much tension that exists between those two parts in our relationship. And that also is where our past experiences can impact us. If our parents rejected our needs or said things like, that's your grandma, go hug grandma. That's what we do. Stop being silly, go hug her, right? That in that moment, that says you in your autonomous self who says, I don't feel comfortable right now giving a hug. I'm good. I just want to leave. That's me. In that moment, a caregiver, your attachment figure is saying, ignore your need, go do that thing. And so then today we might have this unconscious or subconscious map that says, don't share your need, don't share your need, you'll get in trouble. People will be mad at you. They're going to be upset. And that again is where that tension is, because we need you to express what you feel and need in order to co-create that world. So interdependence really comes back to this experience where I have my own thoughts, feelings, opinions, desires, wishes, and values, and my partner has their own. They are separate. And we are responsible for how we communicate them to each other, and then also how we come to a space of building our worlds as a united front.
I love that. I love that sort of framework and keeping that in mind, as we're building relationships together, because it's so much work. We never, you go into this, you get married, you think back of the first day, and then you have kids and you realize that everything shifted and everything changed, and you kind of have to reassess and reevaluate your relationship, not ignore it, because it's so easy to do that. It's easy for weeks to pass. And yeah, I love having this concept of the interdependence and using that as a framework. You mentioned social media before, and I want to touch back on that, because social media paints a picture of perfection, whether it's parenting, relationships, having a clean home, having everything, the best meals on at the table every single night. It's so hard to manage that. And I sometimes I have conversations with my family members, my mom or my mother-in-law, and they're like, we didn't have that. So we didn't have to worry about like, is this perfect or not? Or, so this comes back to how it impacts perhaps a relationship sometimes, where I feel that you mentioned attachment, but there's also a lot of terms out there that we might not have heard before. For example, gaslighting, right? That's a word that I've been hearing every single day from friends, from, online, people just bringing it up, and wrong most of the time. And I feel that there's that term and narcissism being used a lot now. So we have lots of terms that we didn't before that we can use to diagnose our partner and to label what
Please
they're
don't
doing,
diagnose your partner.
right? But that's exactly so how do we in relationships now step back from labeling our partner's attachment style and who they are and whether or not they're a narcissist, or how do we kind of navigate all this stuff?
Let's put this into the framework of the cycle, in the sense that if you bring in labels, you are throwing a grenade into your relationship, into the conversation that you're having, and it will backfire on you because nobody wants to be labeled. And we know this from the research. It's called psychological reactance, right? You tell someone to go do something, they're going to fight up against it and do the opposite. And so if you're saying to someone, you're still avoidantly attached, go to therapy, they're not going to, right?
No way.
We are going to react against that.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. So I have seen this happen, and I actually really love sharing the story because I think it is so important, is that in 2016, a colleague in Ottawa here had actually said, gaslighting, what's that? I've never heard of it. And this is someone that was in the field for quite some time. And now today I can think of sessions where a partner has yelled at their partner in session, see, they're gaslighting me. Do you see it, Dr. Tracy? And it's like, whew, okay, wow, this is really intense. And what I would encourage people to do in those moments is that when that urge to label comes up, I think we need to understand two things. One is that you are feeling something really uncomfortable inside of you, and labeling is your way to discharge that discomfort that's happening. And that blame, that discharging makes complete sense, especially when we think of the developmental perspective, where a child blames. They go through that developmental period where they point outwards and they don't have the mind sight or the ability to see self and other. Developmentally, that makes sense, right? Their brains aren't fully formed. And so then if we don't learn those skills and tools to be able to internal and external self and other, then how easy it is to then project our discomfort outward. So if you notice yourself going to those labels and saying, God, you're always this, you never that, you're such a, notice the discomfort within you first, pausing. I know you talk a lot about this in your community as well, as pausing. We don't have to do anything right away, but that self-regulation in that moment can change how everything is going to unfold. Sounds so easy, and it's yet the most hardest thing and most important thing that we can do. So pausing and asking yourself, what's happening for me in this moment? There's something really big here. I want to put this out. I'm going to choose not to, and maybe take some space to understand this. And then what we can do instead is go to the behavior. What are the facts? What is your partner doing or not doing that you can talk about? And it's not I feel like you're never listening to me. I feel like you don't care about me. Those aren't behaviors. A behavior is when I'm coming to you and sharing about my day, you're on your phone. And when you're on your phone, I feel dismissed. I feel small. I feel like I don't matter, right? Like that, that's part of that. So
I
it's
love that you brought
describing
that in.
behavior.
Yeah, because we often hear about like the feeling, like I feel this, like, and then fill in the blank. But there's the behavior too that we don't bring in, and it's important to bring that in.
Mm.
I love that. I think, parents who are listening, one question that I've been receiving as well is arguments in front of a child. Like sometimes things get really heated. And sometimes there's a boundary crossed in terms of respecting the person that you're having the argument with. If you are in this sort of relationship, my perspective with parents is like the child is listening and watching, and it doesn't matter how old they are, even when they're very young, there is a tone or a certain level of arguing that can impact the child's heart rate and breathing rate. And we've seen that in the research. But from your perspective, what are some things, like how do we put brakes to it, right? But you're still always with the child. So if you're in a really heated moment, what can a parent do in those moments?
That would be hey, we're getting heated. Let's pause this and come back to it. And you have to make sure you're going to come back to it. That's important.
Right. It is important to do that sometimes. Got it.
Yeah. I'm going to say this carefully, and let's make sure we really sort of fine tune our edges around it. It's not bad to disagree in front of your children.
Right.
It's important that children see that, I'm thinking of a conversation of like, oh, I viewed it this way. And you can be like, oh, that's hard for me. I didn't view it that way. And I viewed it differently. And I'm having a reaction to that, right? Like you're processing it in a very kind of a meta way that your children can see that. It's also important that our children see the repair. So if you were sharp, as we all are, or if you were defensive and dismissive, as we all are at times, when we're dysregulated, we go back in front of the children and we say to our partner, I did this recently, actually, and I said to my husband, oh, this morning I got really sharp and I raised my voice, and that couldn't have felt good for you. And that's something that I need to make sure when I'm in that moment, I need to take some breaths. So I just want you to hear me say, I'm really sorry. I did that in front of the kids. And I think showing them the repair is just as important as saying, let's not fight in front of the kids.
Right. Yeah.
And I ask adults in my therapy room, what did you learn about fighting? What did your parents fight in front of you? And many of them will say, no, we didn't fight. They didn't fight. And what did you learn about that in terms of relationships? Well, I learned that you shouldn't fight in relationships. But that also doesn't model what we want them to learn, because disagreeing and arguing is normal. What we don't want, and this is where I want to kind of define those edges, is that there needs to be an agreement between both partners. And this comes from your values, the values of wanting to model to your children what it means to be in a healthy relationship, to be in a loving, respectful relationship. The boundaries around that are things like we don't name call each other. We don't raise voices. We don't attack the other person. And so if that is showing up in front of the children, then you've got to just stop that. And many members inside my community will say, well, they just kept going. And so we talk about if it's at the dinner table, you get up and excuse yourself calmly. We're not getting anywhere right now. I'm just going to go to the bathroom and splash my face, and we'll be done with this conversation. Or sometimes it's about picking up the kids and saying, this isn't okay. We're going to the park. We'll be back in 20 minutes.
Right. That boundary, which you also talk about in your book, those boundaries are so important to have. What are some signs, because we're on this page, I know that this has been brought up as well. What are some, we talk a lot about like different types of abuse sometimes, and we might not realize a bit of that emotional or psychological or, verbal abuse. What should somebody look out for in terms of like having that line has been crossed?
Oh, it's such a tricky one. And I think it's so important that if someone is not there in your relationship to assess it, it's really hard for anyone to label it as such, especially when it's those micro aggressions, the smaller moments. But you have to find those boundaries for you and what that looks like. What we can say is not okay is belittling you,
right? Putting
you down, neglect in any sense. I have a blog post that's around how to prevent emotional neglect in your relationship. That neglect piece is where someone says things like, you're fine, you're always anxious about these things, move on. And I think the reason this is such a tricky boundary piece in terms of like, where's the line, is that some partners lack the awareness of how they were raised and then how they're showing up in the relationship with you.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's okay. But I think the piece that's important is your partner willing to hear you, to take feedback, and then to move forward? Versus when you say to someone, this is a name calling and it doesn't feel good, and I can't let you name call me, particularly in front of the kids, but in general, no name calling.
Right.
And if they repeatedly name call you, then you've got to ask yourself, what am I doing here? And that's a really tough piece to go down. It's a hard road.
But thank you for giving us that way to look at it and sort of question it. I want to go back to those 3 categories that you had in your book. So the aware, acknowledge, and align piece. Just as we're, closing our conversation soon, but so that somebody has that sort of framework again to go back into the relationship now after this conversation, and I encourage everyone to get the book because it will help you. I've put on all the little tabs, and I was just telling Tracy, my husband and I are going to sit together and go through it because I think it's important to kind of go back and reassess certain things. And you've given us questions that we hadn't thought about before that will allow us to understand each other a lot more. So thank you for that. So we spoke about the awareness piece. What is acknowledge and align?
Yes. Acknowledging is looking within ourselves, seeing our own patterns, seeing what we can do differently. Aligning is actually making the different choices. It is one thing to offer ourselves compassion. It's so important. Empathy and understanding. And what we actually need to be doing differently in our relationship is making different choices. And so I wanted that last piece to really show that you have to do something different in your relationship, whether that is for some people of holding that boundary and continuing to hold it. For others, it might be saying, okay, in this moment, I need to stop hiding my own feelings and needs. And I'm actually going to now assert them and say to my partner, here is what I wish, here is what I need. So I divide it that way. And also too, when we think about the process of therapy, it's never linear. So people going through this, please know that therapy is not you start down low and then it's straight line up, but rather you're waxing and waning, just like our life. Those hard moments, we ebb and flow. And we like to think of beginning, middle, and end. And actually the research in psychotherapy talks about the, oh gosh, I wish I could remember them. It's like the R's. There were R's in terms of the phases of therapy, and there are phases. And at the same time, do remember that it goes up and down and ebbs and flows.
I guess similarly to parenting, we, if we were trying to work on our kids' behaviors or their emotion regulation skills, it's never a perfect thing. We're going to have, moments where everything is going really well. And then there's a huge meltdown. And we're like, sometimes it's easy to think that we're messing up. And I guess it's the same thing in the relationship. Like if you're working on this and feel like everything is perfect, and then that you have a big blowout as a couple, and then you're like, I thought we were progressing, but it's not necessarily that you're not progressing because of that big argument, right? Got it. Okay.
Yes. I just had that conversation recently around where we're allowed to make mistakes. And because of the old wiring we have in our brain, in stress, we're going to default back to that. And it's kind of am I still making those steps forward to be different, to try different things? Am I frequently going back to those old patterns that are not feeling good? What's my level of being able to change and move forward? So our relationships are not meant to be perfect, but if you can take one thing away, take this piece, which is learn how to really repair with your partner.
Thank you for saying that. I was going to ask you if there was one thing you wish all couples knew, maybe from the get-go, right? Like you get married, things are easy, everything is lovely. And then things get a little bit more complicated sometimes as years go by. But what's one thing you wish all those new couples knew? And is it the repair piece, you would say? That's the most important one.
Yeah, it's the repair. It's one of the chapters that I have in there too, around 4 A's to get a really good repair in there. People aren't taught how to do this in their relationship. And that's, of course, right? We're learning, watching our parents, and we don't take courses in school on how to be in relationship. And so this is just one of those pieces where if you and your partner can really learn how to do that, you'll be able to tackle many more of those distressing and hard moments together as a team.
I love that. before we go, I do want to thank you for opening up in the book and talking about your life, because this is something, it meant so much to me, because even from my own work as, you know, in neuroscience and specializing in emotions, parents think that I never yell and that I never lose it and I never have bad days and my kids never have bad days. But I try to be honest about that because I want people to feel like they're normal and we're normal too and we're human. And you've opened up to that. And I think it was one of the most beautiful pieces of this book and put everything together. So thank you for opening up and being vulnerable and sharing that with us.
Thank you, Cindy. I deeply appreciate that. It is quite a process to put yourself into a book so vulnerably. And also, I could not have imagined writing this story about the everyday struggles that couples have without including us. We are,
Right.
yes, I have all the skills and tools. Yes, I know what those look like from the objective outsider. And at the same time, I'm human, and relationships are the most important thing to us. And also, they are one of the hardest parts. So
Right.
thank you.
Thank you for that. Anybody who's listening, I will put all the links in the show notes to Tracy's book. I will also put your social media, your website. Do you still have courses on your
I
website?
do.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Amazing content that I really highlight. I recommend everybody click on and visit. Thank you, Tracy, for the work that you have done and for everything you share with us on social media. I'm so happy that we got to chat finally, and I hope we get to chat again soon.
Thank you, Cindy. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks.